Welcome to week 12's lectures. This is your introduction into general epistemology. Uh, more specifically, we're going to be looking at the relationship between truth, belief, and the idea of how this relates, how the two relate in the idea of knowledge. Right? Truth, belief, and justification. So as a reminder from way back earlier in the course, epistemology is the study of knowledge, right? And traditionally, philosophers define things by two factors, right? Necessary conditions and sufficient conditions. And this applies to both aspects of knowledge, both the a priori and the a posteriori. A necessary condition is going to be a need, something that is a condition that must be met for X to obtain, right? So, for example, air is a necessary condition for human life to exist, right? Air is also a necessary condition for combustion, right? Air, in this case, being like the amalgamation of elements that are necessary for either, right? Just a general term of art. A sufficient condition, however, is going to be a condition whose existence is enough to ensure that something exists. So this is going to be a condition that, when met, ensures X's existence. So being a father is a sufficient condition for being a parent, male parent. Right? Not trying to be nuanced here. Or winning the lottery is a sufficient condition for having bought a ticket, right? But the reverse isn't true. Buying a ticket is not sufficient to ensure that you win the lottery. But having won the lottery, it's sufficient to determining that you bought a ticket, right? So it should be understood that not all necessary conditions are sufficient conditions. Just because something is necessary for something else to obtain, just because a condition is necessary doesn't mean that it's enough to ensure that this obtains. So what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge, right? Since that is what epistemology is all about. Well, the traditional or the classical analysis of knowledge is something we get from our old pal Plato. Right? In his dialogue, the Meno, he identifies what knowledge is through what knowledge must be. It's necessary, and he believes sufficient conditions via a conversation between Socrates and the titular character Meno, right? And of course, Socrates comes out on top because that's pretty much every Platonic dialogue. So Meno says that knowledge is true belief, and Socrates comes along and shows how this is not sufficient. Truth and belief might be necessary conditions, but they're not sufficient for determining knowledge. He uses the example of the road to Larissa. Now, in this example, he posits, basically a guide between the town of Thebes and the city of Thebes and the town of Larissa. Right? But this guide is a shit guide. It's a piss poor guide. This guide's you. This guide's probably actually me, given my own sense of direction. Right? So the guide, so bad with their sense of direction that they take the caravan that they're leading off the main roads, and they get lost in the woods. But they pop back out into a clearing from which they can see multiple paths leading in multiple directions. Now there's a path near them that leads right back the way that they came, and it's pretty clear that it does. But there's a whole bunch of paths leading in various areas, in various directions, with no clear markers indicating which one will lead to Larissa, right, which is their destination. And the company, the caravan, turns to the guide and goes, well, okay, which way is it? Because they assume that the guide knows what the fuck he's doing. It's his job, after all. Safe assumption, usually. In this case, just not a good one. And the guide looks and he goes, that way. We're just like northeast. And so they go up the northeasterly path. Right? And it turns out, he believes it. He's got no good reason to believe it, but he does. And it turns out to be true. They hit Larissa. But would we call what the guide's knowledge, what the guide surmised as knowledge? I mean, he believed it. He had, and it turned out to be true, but he had no justification for it, right? It was really more of a lucky guess than it was true justification. No, most of us would say that wasn't knowledge. That was just a good guess, right? Maybe even an educated guess. Probably not, given how shit a guide he is, but it was a guess all the same. And if it's a guess, then it can't be knowledge. So Plato added the further condition of justification to knowledge. So the classical analysis of knowledge is knowledge as JTB, not Justin Timberlake, but JTB, justified, true, belief.